Welcome. You're listening to How I Did That, a storytelling podcast. Let's jump into today's episode.
Today's guest is Aparna Verma, Stanford graduate and author of the new book release, The Boy with Fire, a novel that focuses on the power and manipulation of myth in an Indian-inspired epic fantasy. You can find this podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcast, Google Podcasts, or all other major music platforms. Now let's get into the episode. Hello. Thank you for joining me, Aparna. And I've been wanting to interview you because I know you have The Boy with Fire, your first novel, coming out on August 31st. Yeah, you could take it away, explain a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, well, I always like to say that I'm a proud Indian American immigrant. I was born in Rajasthan, India, which is the desert state of India. I moved to the United States when I was 2, and I realized that I was one of those people who lived within edges or within the hyphens of identity. So Indian American, Mexican American, Chinese American, Irish American. I feel like America is a melting pot of different cultures, and yet, despite being so, if you're an immigrant, you're nonetheless, you're always going to be othered. My experience of being the other and finding a home within that gray space has what inspired me in my own writing, and writing about characters who live within these edges and who don't quite fit in the typical societal norms, and so become beacons of change in that they are creating their own home. They're creating their own space of identity and of acceptance. So The Boy with Fire kind of goes into that, but I think that's just a lifelong journey for me and my future, endeavors.
Going back to high school, were you always interested in writing? And, what kind of creative things were you involved with in high school?
Yeah, well, I always knew as a kid that I wanted to be an author. I didn't know what went into it. It was just something I was like, okay, I'm going to write my book and I'm going to put it out in the world. That's all I thought. But I always knew in the back of my mind that's what I wanted to do. And in high school, I think my favorite classes are, of course, my English classes. And I was super close to my English teacher out of all of my teachers. But in high school, I really delved into journalism for the first time, like working for my high school newspaper, being the editor, of my high school newspaper, like editor-in-chief of my high school newspaper. And then really taking that journalistic, fascination and bringing that into college. So at Stanford, I worked for the Stanford Daily, which is the college-run student newspaper, or the student-run college newspaper, as like a writer, then a desk editor, then a managing editor. Like I rose very quickly through the ranks because I just loved reporting and I loved working for the paper and understanding a community by learning about its people, interviewing its people. And so at Stanford, I also took, all those English classes that I loved in high school. I finally got the chance to actually take creative writing classes at Stanford. And so for my degree, I, ended up being an English major, but I did a concentration in creative writing, specifically fiction. So throughout college, I really learned how to perfect a story, or how to put my thoughts on a page, and how to really study story structure, and not only structure, but the steps of thinking that you have to go through in order to write a story. So I was able to study really amazing authors, got to meet some amazing authors in person, interview them. I think it was my freshman year, I got to interview the U.S. Poet Laureate, which was insane. I was starstruck the entire interview. And then I also got to interview Gino Diaz, who has been canceled now. So he wrote The Brief and Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde. Okay. So he wrote some very, very famous books. But I remember that being the worst interview I've ever done, because he was just such a jackass. He was so mean. And freshman me was just terrified. And now he's canceled for good reason.
I did not know he was canceled.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I guess not every interview goes as perfectly as you envisioned.
Oh, exactly. And I think as a freshman, I was terrified, starstruck and terrified, and he didn't make it any better. Mm-hmm. He would just aggravate the situation a bit more. But what I took away from being able to interview these authors is really if the interview went well or if it didn't, what I really took away was how they approached writing, because everyone approaches writing and storytelling in a different way. We all have our different methods in getting into the creative mode. Like some people listen to music, some people like to take a walk. I like to like be very physical. But then also understanding how when they're sitting at their desk, what goes through their mind before as they're writing a scene. Like, you know, like there's always a conversation between a plot driven story or a character driven story. And there's merits to both. I always like to have a blend of that. I think like some of my most favorite books have both plot and character. Some of them are just vibes. And that's okay too. But I think some of the best books that I've read really delve into the character's mindset, so man versus self. And that's something that you, as a writer, have to start with it. Like that has to start within yourself. So as a writer, you have to really delve deep into your own motivations and understanding how those motivations translate into the characters. I think as writers, we very much put ourselves on the page, even if it's fiction, because our characters are in a way a reflection of ourselves. They're not totally accurate. They might take an attribute. Like, for example, Yasin Knight, who is an assassin, who I don't think I can ever be, is a very introspective character. And I think that's something that I have. I am sometimes an introvert. I am very much an extrovert, but I have my introverted moments where I would just rather sit down, have my tea, and just sit at my desk, you know, and like really write and be with myself. And I'm okay with that solitude. And that's something Yasin has in the story.
Okay, so I wanted to touch on a few points that you talked about. The first one is like when you were an English major and then you focus on creative writing, do you think just being an English major alone, that what the 4 years, like the classes you take for 4 years, do they equip you with the kind of knowledge you would need to write this type of book? Or was it more your creative writing classes that really helped push that forward?
I would say it's a blend. I also feel like when you write a novel, you always feel unprepared. No matter how many creative writing, or if you get an MFA, which is like, you know, the Masters in Fine Arts, which is for creative writing. Like, I think for me, and English classes really helped me understand how to break down a story at a cellular level. So like understanding, like, you know, amazing writers like Borges or Flaubert or Camus, and also like Jhumpa Lahiri, right? I'm forgetting her name. I'm gonna mispronounce. Anandavati Roy. I love her books, and like really understand. And Bharat Mukherjee, like she's three amazing badass South Asian writers, women writers, and understanding how they wrote their short stories, and breaking down at a cellular level character motivations, plot, structure, but also the beauty of their language. When you look at a line of either poetry or of a story, you know, there's some of those lines where they really stick with you, right? Like as you're reading, you're like, wow, like there are some lines where you just pause. And what I found out is that in a way, there's a very mechanical, almost like scientific way to create those lines. And that has to be like, goes to the musicality of language. So if you study like the iambic pentameter, or if you study like even music, each word has a beat. If you scan it, there's stressed and unstressed syllables, and there's certain combinations that are very pleasing to the human ear, just scientifically. And sometimes when you look at these lines in novels, they follow that same formula. So in a way, it's almost guaranteed that line's going to like stick out to you. So that's one of the things that I, you know, found really amazing and interesting on just a cellular level, and that was my English classes. But going into the creative writing classes, I think they really allowed me to write anything and everything without fear of judgment. Like I wrote some very weird short stories that I don't think will ever see the light of day. But it was fun to have that creative playground to just create without fear of judgment and allow my mind to wander and play with words and create stories. And I think that really helped me have that freedom and I think that creative juice and spark that I needed when writing The Boy with Fire.
So you had mentioned like plot-driven versus character-driven novels earlier. So can you give some examples and which one is The Boy with Fire?
So a plot-driven story is a story where the actions in the novel or the movie or whatever you're reading or watching drives is like the main driving force of of the story. So say for example, I'm trying to think of a plot-driven story. I really find like fast, like John Wick. Okay, like that is very much a plot driven. Like I do not care for John Wick as the character. Like he killed people because they killed his dog. Like I get it, I understand, right? But I think that's a movie that's very plot driven, like fast paced action scenes that go from one end to the other. And you just are kind of along for the ride. And some people really love that. Like, they love when it's like scene to scene to scene. And that's what drives you to keep on reading and to keep on watching. A character-driven a story is more where there doesn't necessarily have to be actions, like a chain reaction of events, even though like that's how stories work. It's more so the story is more so centered on the character and their internal struggles. So a story that I think of that.
Does Harry Potter count?
Harry Potter, I guess, like Harry Potter, I think is a bit of both, right? Like it's plot driven because of like, the subplot of Voldemort coming back to life, the prophecy, all of that. But it's very character driven in that, like, we have Harry, Hermione, Ron, and he fall in love with them, right? So it's those, I think character driven stories are amazing in that you really get to understand a character, and maybe you end up hating them, but maybe you end up loving them. But it's like undeniable that the story is about the character and not about the events that are happening in the book, if that makes sense.
I see. Throughout college, what other ways were you able to get exposure to creative writing or any other things that kind of inspired you to be like, I am going to move forward and put out my own novel in the future?
There was this one creative writing class that I took my sophomore year called the Novel Writing Intensive. And it was part of more of like a international movement, and it's called NaNoWriMo. And NaNoWriMo stands for National Novel Writing Month, which is in November. And basically what happens around the world, people write a novel, like in a month. So you write a 50,000 word novel in a month during the month of November. And it's a global event. And I thought, what better way as an overachiever to force myself to write a book than to take a class where it's like, based on my grade. Like if I don't do it, I'm going to suffer. And like, that's a good motivation. I think if you're like, especially like a South Asian kid, like, your grades matter. And so I took that class. And that's where I think that the first very, very messy manuscript of The Boy with Fire came into being. It was like 53,000 words of straight trash. It was so bad. I have not looked at the manuscript since. But I think that that class really taught me, one, to be a writer, you have to write or think about writing every day. That's inescapable. Because as a writer, you're constantly thinking about your characters, or they're always in the back of your mind. And what NaNoWriMo showed me was that there's always a fear that I have before starting a story. No matter, like I've already written a novel, and I still get scared before I start writing. Like, oh, what if I write it's trash? What if it's not good? But NaNoWriMo taught me, first drafts are always going to be terrible, and you have to take away the judgment of yourself, like, of you judging yourself when you sit down to write. Don't expect perfection. Don't expect, the next Pulitzer Prize winning novel. That all takes time. So just sit down on the page and allow yourself to play with the words, and don't have any expectations or judgments along for that ride. So that really helped me, I think, in my writing mindset. I think there's like so many things that make a writer. One is, of course, the writing itself, but the second is the mindset that a writer needs to have in terms of like how to approach story and how to also be gentle with yourself when you're writing a story.
So that was one of the main ways that you got inspiration through college, as well as like you were working on the Stanford Daily and other like doing interviews yourself, like through, well, that was for the Stanford Daily, right? You interviewing authors and other people, as well as like your creative writing and English major as well. So when you had written that first draft for that class, where did that inspiration come from? Because you had to write a novel. So how did you choose The Boy with Fire? And was it originally called that, or did you refine the name after?
No, like it wasn't called. Oh my God, I don't even remember what it was called back then. I don't remember I think I just called it The Assassin or something.
The Assassin.
Yeah, I think it was a really shitty title, but I got that. So The Boy with Fire is a story that has been in my mind for like a very, very long time. The genesis was that when I was 13 years old, and I wanted to write about an assassin named Yasin, and that was it. Like I was like, okay, I'm gonna write a story about that. And it has always been in the back of my mind. And before it was just like an adventure story. But I think as I matured and I really understood the art of storytelling, and I became more serious about being a writer, that story matured with me and it really developed, and it's like light years away from what it was when I was 13 years old, right? Like when I first had that genesis. So when I wrote the very, very first draft of The Boy with Fire for that class, I, at that point, did not have a plot. Like I did not know I did not have an outline. It was really bad. In October for the class, like we tried to plan of like, we read other stories that were in that 50,000 word realm and understood like how did the writer create this and really studied that. And then we made a very shady or at least I made a very shady outline. Like it was just terrible. But when I went to the page, I was just like, I know this is going to be set in a kingdom where I know these certain events are going to happen. And in some ways, that hasn't changed in the final manuscript, in the published book that is today. Like there are two main events that was in the very shitty first draft that stayed. But other than that, like everything else went away. So in terms of inspiration of how I found out to write, I just knew that these two events need to happen. And somehow I'm going to find a way to create a story around it, which is a very, very terrible way to approach a novel. But that was my first rodeo, and I learned a lot from it.
Wow. So you had this inspiration like way back when, because you wanted to write a story about an assassin named Yasin.
Yeah, and then, because it rhymed.
Yeah. And then your 13-year-old self is like, score, like I've got the poetry down. So now then you're like, okay, I got to take this class. And you ended up writing that 50,000 plus words.
Yeah.
Maybe at that point or after when you refined it, how does your real life tie in with the novel, if it does at all?
Yeah, well, I will say, so that first draft was thrown out the window. Like there's no scene or any lines from that first draft that is in the published book. Like it's sitting in a box under my bed. I'm afraid to even look at it. But when I wrote the real first draft of the published book, that was during the pandemic of 2020. And I find that many books that are going to come out of the pandemic 2020 will be very dark books. And The Boy with Fire is such a book. And so I think for me, The Boy with Fire is definitely not a personal reflection. It's not a memoir. It's not a retelling of Hindu mythology, even though I was very much inspired by it. I will say, though, some of the direct inspirations that I took from our real world was more so the political, economic things happening in the world around that time and from before 2020. So what I mean by that is, The Boy with Fire really investigates the dangerous blend of alt-right politics and nationalism and religion. So what happens when alt-right nationalists have used religion as like their soapbox and in order to control others and to control your way of life and to assume some sort of power. And we've seen that happen so many times throughout human history, where kings say that they have divine rule, or like even now, like the Taliban saying like we should have an Islamic state, or where the word of God is like how we are going to rule our government. And so that's some modern day politics that I really tried to understand, and that influenced some of the the religion that's in the book, but also the way that the government of the Kingdom of Ravens, it's very much built on divine rule, where it's believed that the king and the royal family has been blessed by the gods, and that's why they are the rulers of this land. And in the book, there are like alt-right nationalists, and they're called gold caps. And funny thing is, they were first called red caps. And my editor was like, "This is too close to Trump, to Trump supporters with the red caps, and we should probably change this." And I was like, "You're right." And so we changed it to gold caps. And they were not like, a direct representation, I think, of Trump supporters. But I think what's interesting is that when you look at people who tend to support very charismatic and extreme leaders, they have similarities in being sometimes ignorant of reason, and not willing to understand the other side or to engage in fruitful discussion that question their philosophy. I think that when you are a very ardent supporter, it's very hard to change your mindset. And we see that across the board, no matter if you're alt left, alt right, in the middle. Like, I think there's extremism in all kinds of form. And The Boy with Fire shows that extremism when it comes to religion.
Okay. And then aside from real life, like aside from your own life, were there any other authors who's like you took inspiration from, or any other authors or their novels that you were taking inspiration from, or kind of just this was all just happening around you? Or
I love Neil Gaiman. I think Neil Gaiman is one of my. I got to meet him. I got to give him a hug. He's the best.
Who is he?
Neil Gaiman is this British author who has been very prolific throughout his life. He started writing when he was 20. And so for me, he's very much like a role model on how to continue to be relevant and successful and keep writing as an author. He's maybe now in his 50s or something. He wrote Sandman, which is now the Marvel character. Like, he wrote those comics and then sold it to Marvel as a young 20-year-old without really knowing what he was doing. So I think he left himself out a lot of money. But he's written some amazing books that have become into TV shows and movies. And he tends to have a very, almost like a magical, dark, whimsical, I think, funny writing. I don't know how else to describe it. Like, his writing is just, he has his own brand of writing, and he brings in that dry British humor. But I think he's one of the few male writers who I think writes women really well. And that's something that I, value when I read like male authors. Like, okay, you can tell very quickly, I think, the writer's, I think, skill, especially for a male writer, when they can't write about how they write their women. And I think Neil Gaiman writes his women like realistically, without really focusing on their sexuality as other male writers do.
I see what you mean, yeah.
And making them more human than like sexual objects. So Neil Gaiman has definitely been a lifelong inspiration. I think on a writer that I discovered recently is Jesmyn Ward, who also came from Stanford. So she was a Stegner Fellow at Stanford, which is kind of like Stanford's MSA program. And she's amazing. Every sentence of hers deserves to be in a museum. Like, it's so good. Like, her books, I read As a Caged Bird Sings, and that was my first book of hers, and it almost made me cry. Like, I'd never cry. Like, the only book that has made me cry is Book Thief. That's it, when I was in middle school or something. And this is a book that I was very close to tears, and she just has a very lyrical style of writing, where she brings almost poetry to a novel. Even though it's written, as like a novel, it's not written in verse. So I think for me, she was just a writer who I like to emulate in my writing, and having that very lyrical, beautiful prose that, that's not only sounds pretty, but I think hits at the emotional level of the reader. I think she does that really, really well. And she's one of those authors, like, if no matter what book she puts out, like, I will definitely like buy it and read it.
So those were your two main like inspirations in terms of authors? Because in terms, well, while we're on the subject of writing style, I was going to ask, how did you find your writing style?
Yeah. I think that's a funny question because I feel like my writing style is always going to evolve. Like, my writing style since The Boy with Fire has definitely improved, I think. And that's because as a writer, you're always reading, you're always writing. And writing itself is a practice. It's almost like a muscle. The more you exercise it, the better it's going to be. So book 2 of The Boy with Fire, of the Ravens trilogy is going to be even better than book 1, which is how trilogy should work, right? Book 2 should be better than book 3 should be the best, or, whatever. So for me, I guess my writing style is lyrical. I would say that it's lyrical, it's dark, metaphorical, but it tends to very much connect the characters to the land and the divinity within that. So I always believe that the land from which you come from, or the home that you make, very much defines you and defines your character, your motivations, and sometimes even your dreams. I really much believe in, like, you are a product of your environment. And that just comes through my novels, and the way that the characters really interact with the land. In this one, it's like how characters interact with the desert. And I, being born from a desert, it's very close to home for me. And so in a way, there's a divinity that comes to that, like how you understand land, how you worship it, how it cares for you, and how you can care for that. So I think my writing really just, explores the connection of man and his environment, not in a climate change kind of way, but in a more emotional, ancestral level.
Because when I have read books in the past, like, you can very easily tell apart the way, like, if you read 2 books, you'll be able to tell if it's the same person writing them usually or not.
Oh yeah.
And I wondered, it's like, I kind of just wondered, do these writing styles, it just comes to someone? Like, for example, if I write an essay versus if someone else writes it, I don't really think about my writing style, but when I read it versus someone else's work, I'm like, oh, like, this is the way I write. But it's very difficult for me to change it, because I'm like, I don't know how else I can word this essay. This is my essay. You know what I mean? So it's like, is it something that you taught yourself, or did your writing style just come through years of, like, doing English?
Yeah, I think writing style is very much something that evolves, and it continues to continue to grow and change. But it's something that can't be forced. I think it's, in a way, it's an amalgamation of your experiences, the things that you read, and there are improvements in your writing as you continue to write and study writing throughout the years. I will say there are times when I do make conscious efforts to improve my writing style. And in a way, like, I try to be more lyrical in my writing. Like, I try to understand, to create those connections with the land, like I was talking about before, and really create metaphors that hit hard at an emotional level. And I think that comes from reading Jasmine Ward and John Steinbeck, like, reading these, and Ernest Hemingway. Like, I love Ernest Hemingway, even though he's also a dick as a person, because he's just very machismo and, like, has toxic masculinity. But I think what his writing does really well, it's very bare, but beautiful. Like, he is able to express an emotion or a character with very few words. There's this exercise that I think a lot of English majors or English writers do, and it's called a 6-word story, and it's very much inspired by Ernest Hemingway. It's like this iconic thing where he wrote a story. Someone told him that he can't write a story in 6 words, and he said, bet. And then he said, I think it was like, for sale, baby shoes never worn. Like, and in that's a story.
Wow.
Right?
Yeah.
You're like, holy crap, that's a story. And I think that was an exercise we would do as English majors, like, how do I write a story like that in 6 words? Mm-hmm. Because that tells you, okay, there's loss. There's triumph. Okay, there's a baby. Mm-hmm. And there's loss because those baby shoes were never worn. So, there's heartache, there's an emotional arc, there's grief. And so from just those 6 words, So I think that's where the beauty, and that's why I love English and I love storytelling. Is like in just a few words, you can really describe a very human emotion and interaction and story. And so that's Ernest Hemingway. And it's writers like these that I try to emulate in my own writing, and that have really helped me understand their writing styles and how I can blend that into my own writing.
Okay, cool. So I wanted to now focus more on your book, right? So The Boy with Fire comes out August 31st, which is just a few days away from now that we're recording it. But I think when this episode comes out, it's going to be a little after the 31st. But let's talk about, so you talked about, you made that first draft, right, in the class. But after that, what was the writing process like for you to say, hey, I'm going to, bring this to a publisher and I'm going to write multiple drafts and try to get it published? And, what was that whole process like? Because writing a draft because you have to in a class versus actually going all the way and publishing your book is a big jump.
Yeah. I mean, for me, I really started getting serious about a book, a novel, the spring of my senior year. I think there was like kind of this pressure that I put upon myself where I was like, okay, I'm about to graduate from Stanford University with an English major, but what do I have to show for it? Right. I feel like I had other peers who were part of amazing like research journals, or I had a lot of STEM major like friends, like they were all like in engineering, and they were like working in these amazing labs, like finding discoveries, or like some of them were like working on like vaccine research, or how to create mechanical hearts for children. And I was like, what am I doing, right? What do I have to show for my degree or for my Stanford experience? And I had a friend who was about to get published with New Degree Press, which is the same publisher that I had. And I reached out to her, and she was also an English major. She was my year. And I was like, if she can do it, then I can, right? And so I think that was really the impetus of like, I have this story that has been living and brimming in me for so long. And I always knew at the back of my head, one day I'm going to publish it. But it was always like a thing that you would say, like, one day I'll do it. Like one day I'll go to Hawaii, or one day I'll like build a house by a lake, or, it's like one of those dreams. But in the spring of 2020, I really decided to make that dream a reality. And so I took this novel writing, another novel writing intensive class through Georgetown University called the Creators Institute. And through that, I was paired with an amazing editor who I still work with now, Clayton Boyle, who is my developmental editor. And basically, it's an editor who helps you through the first draft process. And so he was really helpful in helping being a sounding board, where I would give ideas and talk about the novel. And really, he was the first person to read The Boy with Fire. And so through that, I wrote maybe like a 90,000 word manuscript through that in like 3 to 4 months. So that was the first draft, like the real first draft of The Boy with Fire. And I finished that in the summer of 2020.
Okay. So did you need like a publishing house to say, hey, we're going to publish your novel, and then you get an editor to help you do the first draft?
No, you don't need that. You can before you go to publisher, you need to have a book. Like you need to have a manuscript.
Oh, you don't have like a contract before you even start?
Yeah, no,
I see.
No. Because publishers won't look at you without a manuscript on hand. Like it might change when you give it. Like, they'll go through their editors. Like you definitely have to edit and everything, but like you need to have a product with you when you reach out to presses. And so I already had a manuscript, and I wanted to go to New Degree Press because they were a very different kind of publisher. They're a hybrid publisher, and so I'm gonna go on my soapbox and kind of educate people on like how publishing has very much changed and needs to still change. Publishing is a very old white man controlled industry. And there's now 3 avenues of publishing. The oldest, and here is the strongest and the oldest white supremacy industry, is the traditional publishing. And those are the big five, now almost four houses in New York City. And they have their small imprints or smaller press. And the way to get published to them is you have your manuscript, you query for an agent who is going to be a representative, because you can't reach out to these presses yourself. For what you need a middleman for whatever reason. And so you first pitch it to an agent, and that might take years before an agent decides to sign you. And then you might edit your book with them until your agent's like, okay, I think your manuscript is ready. And then you're going to go on, you're going to shop your manuscript to these big publishing houses. And that might take another, 2 to 10 or how many years until a publishing firm was like, actually, I like this manuscript, or an editor, it's like, this is interesting to me, I'm going to buy it. And then it might be another 2-3 years of editing before it comes out. So a book since the day you write it could take 10 years to publish in the traditional publishing world, which is insane. And the worst thing is, I think, is like, you don't own your book anymore. The publishing houses buys the rights of your book. And so you get royalties, and you don't really get a lot. And authors of colors tend to get very little royalties. You don't get the same amount of treatment. Like, it's just an industry that needs to be disrupted. And that's me being my Silicon Valley Stanford talk. Like, I grew up, I guess I really became a professional in the tech startup world. And so I was very much used to seeing smaller startups or smaller companies disrupt age-old industries. And I think that really much like turned me off from traditional publishing. It's like, I didn't want to be controlled in that way. So now there are two more avenues of publishing. One is self-publishing, which I think a lot of people are aware of. Like, self-publishing is like, you can have your book, you can put it on Amazon the next day, and it's out in the world.
But you can't have like a paperback copy if you self-publish, right? Like, it's not going to be in chapters.
You can. Oh. So on Amazon, like, you can do that, and you get royalties from Amazon. You just need to put your manuscript out there, so it can come as an ebook, hardcover, and paperback, and Amazon will print it. It's called print on demand. So whenever a reader buys a book, the Amazon will print it, and so you don't have to deal with inventory.
What about like putting it in chapters or one of those big bookstores?
And bookstores. So that could also be through self-published, but self-published authors or indie authors have a harder time doing that, because bookstores or indie bookstores tend not to work with indie authors as much, which is too bad. I decided to go with a different route of publishing, which is a newer one, which is called hybrid publishing. So hybrid publishing is a blend of both traditional and self. So what you do is you have the infrastructure of a traditional publisher. So you have your developmental editor, you have your manuscript editor, you have your layout editor, your copy editor, your proofreader, your cover designer, cover artist. You have everything that will be in a publishing house in your hybrid press. And the one that I use, New Degree Press. The caveat is you have to pay for that, right? And that's where it veers towards vanity publishing, where a lot of authors get turned off. Like, you should never pay to get published. It's just wrong, and I agree. New Degree Press is different in that there was almost an Indiegogo campaign, which is very similar to a Kickstarter or a GoFundMe. So when I had my first draft and I shopped it to New Degree Press, like, they greenlit it, so they accepted my manuscript. Like, okay, we're going to do this, and this is and basically I went into their hybrid model where I had to fundraise the funds to get my book published, the initial funding. So through that, I was able, our initial goal was like $5,000. We ended up raising almost close to $8,000. And so I was now able to publish a ebook, a paperback, and a hardcover, and basically pay for the infrastructure of like all my editors, the printing costs, all of that for the initial push of putting my book out there. The best thing is I get to own the rights of my book. So if a movie, like, if a film agent wants to come, like, I can sell my film rights, my audio rights, my printing rights to any other publisher. So if another bigger house wants to pick it up, they can, because I am the one who's selling it. So I get to keep it, and I get to have more royalty. I get a bigger paycheck through that.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah. So that's the thing about hybrid publishing. It's not everyone's cup of tea, because as you know, like, the marketing falls on you. You have to be your biggest supporter, and like you don't have the big marketing infrastructure that a traditional publisher might have. Like they have a whole team. Hybrid publishers usually just you and maybe one other person. And so through New Degree Press, I was able to run a pre-order for my books. I think we sold over maybe like 200 copies, or like got people to like get 200 copies or so. And now on August 31st, what happens is that it's now going to go up on Amazon and Ingram Sparks, which is the behind the scenes printing distributor, who will then send it out to like Barnes and Nobles, indie bookstores. Like indie bookstores can also like order it through Ingram Sparks. Book Depository, which is a bigger international book website. So international readers can also get the book. And from there on, it's all print on demand. So whenever a reader wants a book, they can get it directly from Amazon or through like these online book websites. And I get the royalty through that. And New Degree Press gets none of it. It's just me.
Oh, so then how does New Degree Press make money? Because you did the fundraising in the beginning.
The fundraising goes all to them.
So that was just a few thousand. So later on, do they never make money from helping publish the book?
No.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah. So they publish a lot of authors, though. I think so. Like that's how they are able to.
So it's easier to get accepted, and that's how they make money initially because you paid them.
They turn the profit. Yeah. And so they have lots of authors, and like it takes about $6,000 dollars to like print like hardcover and paperback. I don't know what their margins are. Like maybe they get a big cut. Like maybe it doesn't really cost that much, but all that fundraising goes towards them, and that's amazing because what was great about New Degree Press is that people of color had an easier time getting published, and voices that you wouldn't really hear from, you get the opportunity to hear from, which is what I really admired about them.
When did this model of publishing like kind of start becoming more prevalent?
I have no idea. I have no idea about the history of hybrid publishing or when vanity publishing became a thing. I know a New Degree Press is very much it's a first press, and I did a lot of research that has this business model. I haven't seen anything else like this.
Okay.
So it's insane that they're able to do this. I definitely think the editors should be paid more because a lot of manuscripts, and my manuscript was longer than most. Like they tend to work with manuscripts like up to like 80,000 words, and mine was like 130,000 something. And the book 2 is going to be longer, and book 3 is going to be the longest. But that's okay. I think that kind of goes with the territory.
Because you mentioned that it was like people of color, right, had an easier time getting published with this publishing house. Can you talk a bit about like being a woman and being a person of color? There probably are not a lot of people in that niche, like author-wise. And I'm just wondering, what does it feel like to navigate that? Like, as you mentioned, regular publishing houses were all just like old white men. And people don't always want to listen to the voices of those like people of color. And right, because you have a harder time getting published. And that was a fact. So I don't know, like, how was it like navigating that space?
I think for me, traditional publishing definitely has its merits. And I think there's a growing force now of agents. First, there's agents of color. There are more agents of color, and so there are more people of color entering the publishing world in these houses. And so when you're represented on like the people who pay the checks, then you're more likely for your manuscript to be bought, right, and to be sold and then to be printed. And so I am all for that. I will say it's not happening at a pace that I'm very happy with. Very much so in traditional publishing houses is that usually writers who are white tend to get more funding or are better promotion than authors of color. I think there was a study, I wish maybe I would send you a graphic of it. But in the last, I think 50 or 60 years, there's only been I think less than 20% authors of color who were published.
Wow.
And I don't quote me on the study. I'll find it. I remember was going through.
I'll link it in the podcast description.
I was going through publishing Twitter and the industry space, but that was very eye opening. And I think it shows you, we're seeing more authors of color being published today, but it's very, very recent. The industry before that has been very white, very sterile, tends to have cis characters, and so we're slowly seeing that change. I will say, I think being a younger writer, we tend to understand change a little bit better. And what I mean by that is like we have, I think, more of a drive to demand that change now versus like in the future. Like, some of maybe our predecessors would be happy with, would more likely accept like, okay, this change might be coming in 10 or 15 years. Like, I think younger writers demand, and readers really demand that this change needs to happen now. Mm-hmm. And we're seeing that happen across the board, not only in publishing, but in other industries. Like, in the movie industry, we want more people of color on our screens. Mm-hmm. Shang-Chi, the new Marvel movie, is about to come out, and like it's the first, I think, like Asian superhero that we're getting. Like,
I think so too, yeah.
Right? It's like insane. And now I'm like, we need an Indian woman superhero. Like, I want Jhansi Kirani. Like, she would be an amazing superhero, right? So, I think being a young writer and wanting change, I think we have the tools now through social media to promote that change, and really put our products, our books in the forefront of readers. And what I mean by that is like TikTok has been changing the game. And I think a journalist, when they interview like book talkers, which are like, TikTokers who talk about books, they are stupefied that this is a thing. But I think us being Gen Z is like, yeah, like this is normal. Like this, like it's not as much of a surprise for us. And basically what happens is that book talk, which is one of the trending hashtags on TikTok, has the ability to make writers' careers now. There have been stories of writers getting book deals, like 6-figure book deals, because of book talk. Because one of their TikToks went viral, and the publishing industry agency like signed them, which is insane. That. Yeah, that has happened to writers of our age. And I think being someone who's social media savvy, and maybe this is a good segue into the marketing of the book, I was able to really hone in and find my niche and bring The Boy with Fire to people, to the forefront of readers. And I really credit that through social media. And like being a young person who really understands social media, I was a social media manager for tech startups. Like that's my like regular job. Like that's my career. And so it was fun to use that for a personal project and my book, and not really have a supervisor. Like I know what's best for a book, and then to have fun with social media to really promote it and put it in front of readers.
That is cool that you could tie your day job and the skills you learn with, your book. And okay, exactly. Before we get into the marketing, I never asked you for a synopsis of your book. So could you give us an overview, maybe the characters, kind of what it's about, and then readers will have to read the book for the rest of the knowledge.
So The Boy with Fire is a South Asian epic fantasy about an ex-assassin, an heir, and a tyrant's struggle for power when an ancient prophecy threatens to destroy their world. And that's kind of like the elevator, like the one-line elevator pitch. On a deeper level, The Boy with Fire is a story about consequence and about a world teetering on the edge of war, and about the people who push it over the edge. So it's a story that very much delves into the power of religion, the power of myth, and how people who we consider our leaders can manipulate our systems of belief for their own gain, and how that affects not only those people who are manipulating it, but also regular day people who are just like regular civilians. So hopefully that made sense.
No, that did. And also, like, I had seen a lot of the fan art on Instagram and Twitter. People were going crazy over the characters, and people had like made their own artwork behind it. And can you talk a little bit about a few of your main characters as well?
Yeah. So the Boy with Fire is told through 3 POVs. So the perspectives of 3 characters. One of them is Yasin Knight, the assassin. Yasin the assassin. I'll never get old. That never gets old. So Yasin Knight is mixed race in the book. And so he is that character that lives within edges. And I think that I really drew from my own experience of being an immigrant, living between 2 different identities. and nationalities to write his character and some of his internal struggles. So he is an assassin who was born in Ravens. His mom is Ravani and his dad is Jamdari, which is the direct rival of Ravens. And so his parents had a hard time because their marriage was, not accepted by society. And Yasin is always viewed as a stranger, as an other, as an abomination. And so when his parents died and he became an orphan, he fell into the ranks of a underground criminal organization called the Arahasin. And he basically committed treason against Ravens. And that came from being a child of anger, of not really being accepted, and him taking that out of getting revenge in a way of the country that he was from, but refused to call him their own. When the book starts, Yasin has fallen out of ranks from the Arahasin, and so he decides to seek refuge from an old friend who gives him this ultimatum. He says, I'll help you get amnesty from within Ravens, if you help me with one final mission. And the final mission is to defend the heir of Ravens from the Arahasin. So Yasin has to backstab the very criminal organization that has taught him, that has basically helped him survive in order to get freedom. So that's Yasinite. Now the heir of Ravens, who we get to have a POV from, is Elena Adia Ravens. And she is badass. She is very much a character who I drew inspiration from, like Ma Kali. And I don't know, this would probably add like 10 more minutes to the podcast, but I could go into why Ma Kali is so amazing, and she's the most misunderstood Hindu goddess, and her propensity between goodness and evil really inspired me to write Elena, who is very much, I think, what we call in the industry morally gray, in that she knows that she is to become a queen, and she very much believes that she is ready, but she lacks one integral ability, and that is the ability to hold fire. In Ravens, in order for an heir to be crowned, they need to show that they can hold fire, that they have the power of the gods to hold fire. And Elena is struggling. So the coronation is weeks away, and she can't hold fire. And if she can't do it, she can't become queen.
She's living on the edge.
She's living on the edge, exactly. And then the last POV, which a lot of fans love, is Leo Malhari Ravens, who people like to call looks like Amitabh Bachchan. I will say, when I never thought that. But
what? I saw the fan art for the first time, and I was like, oh my God, it is.
Really? That's so, because when we made that fan art, when I was working with the artist, when I showed it to my dad, the first thing he said is it looks like Amitabh Bachchan. I was like, no, he doesn't. But everyone says that. So I'm like, I guess. But Leo Malhari Ravens is the current king and tyrant of Ravens and Elena's dad. And he is not quite ready to give up the throne. So when there's this ancient prophecy that comes around saying that the phoenix will send her prophet, and the prophet will burn down everything, will burn down the kingdom of Ravens. And when Leo finds out this prophecy is true and the prophet is alive and here, he goes on this rampage to not only defend his legacy, but defend his kingdom for Elena. So his whole story is one of a parent, I think, almost wishing the best for his daughter. And I think in fantasy, and especially when it comes to South Asian fantasy, we always see a disconnect between the daughters and the fathers, or very toxic, I think, children to the parent relationship. And I want to show a relationship, a father-daughter relationship that was strong, even though they have their struggles. There's very much love between them, even though they may not say it, which I think is very South Asian. I remember seeing a tweet someone said where Leo Malhari Ravens is very much like your Asian dad, in that he won't say I love you, but will bring a tray of fruit to say that.
Yep.
Right? But Leo, instead of doing that, will burn anything for Elena. So it goes to the extreme. He's very much an extremist.
Wow, that is very interesting. And that was a very like great explanation of all the characters because I
Thank
did
you.
remember I saw five main characters like in the
Oh,
fan
the
art,
other
but I
two
guess
are
it's
the secondary characters.
okay. So it's only told from like those three perspectives. Who are the two secondary characters?
Yeah. So the other one is Firma, who is the badass and one of my favorites. Firma is Elena's spear or her head bodyguard, her closest confidant, and she is a Yumi. So the Yumi is a race within the kingdom of ravens, within this a race that I basically made up, and I don't think it's ever been seen in fantasy before. So I give myself a pat on the back for that. But the Yumi were very much inspired by the Chandikas, and the Chandikas are the female warriors created by Kali in Hindu mythology. And so the Yumi are a race of warriors in which the women hair is a weapon. So their can be silky and smooth, but when they are instigated or when they need to protect, their hair can turn to a million sharp shards that can cut through steel and flesh. So they don't need a gun, they don't need a sword, they have their hair. And the reason I really wanted that strove to make a character, a race like that, I think is in South Asian culture, hair is very important. I think in terms of bonding, especially for mother and daughter, when you do your tail malish, right?
Yeah.
And sometimes hair can be seen as frivolous, like a girly thing. I wanted to make hair a source of power for women. So it's only the women of the Yumi who have this power. The men are healers. So again, diverting, like, women are usually the caregivers, the healers. No, the men are in their culture, and the women are the warriors. And so that's who Firma is. Like, she is a warrior, she is a badass, and her hair is a weapon. The other secondary character is Samson. And so he's the best, he's the childhood friend of Yasin who offers to give him refuge. And Samson is an immigrant. So he is from Seshar, which is a colonized land by the Janthari. And so Samson, despite, also being a part of the RSN, escaped when he was very young, and was able to climb the ranks of the Janthari military. And so he is a very wealthy general who now has his own private army, and he is the most eligible bachelor as well. And so when the crowning is about to happen weeks away, Leo decides to forge an alliance with Samson, and through marriage. So Samson is going to be married to Elena, and the Kingdom of Ravens gets his army in exchange, and his army has a track record of never losing. Like, they've always won any war they were a part of. And Samson gets a throne in exchange.
Wow. Okay. That was a lot of information. I'm really excited to read this because I ordered the ebook and it should be coming to my email, right? So very excited for this. Okay. Thank you for that great synopsis. Now I want to move forward to marketing. You've been hyping the book up for like months. Like, I've been seeing it on Instagram and Twitter and TikTok and all these places. So can you talk a little bit about that? Because you did say that you've been doing all of it yourself. And how has that been? Because after the book comes out, how will it change?
How will the marketing change?
Yeah, is it gonna change at all, or are you gonna continue doing the same thing you have been doing, or how has the marketing aspect of it been?
Yeah, so I very much wanted to pinpoint and focus on how this novel is very different from others, and how it really gives representation for South Asians. I think in the fantasy world, there are very, very few South Asian epic fantasies, especially those like inspired by Hindu mythology. Like, I can't think of another book. Like, I've never read a book like this, right? Like, you're shaking your head too. So when I did my marketing, I honed in on how this book is different, like how it has this very beautiful, diverse rep of not only South Asian characters, but also mixed South Asian characters. Of also having badass women who are unapologetic and men who bow to them. I think by really understanding, I think, what I wanted as a reader, and using that in my own marketing, I was able to find like-minded readers who are very, very excited for The Boy with Fire, who now make their own TikToks about it. Some have done cosplays, people have made fan art. And so I think it all started when I identified as a reader why I wanted to write The Boy with Fire. And that was one of the representations of the story. And how, if I had read the book as, when I was 18, why I would have loved it. And so I just put that into my marketing, and I was very genuine, I think, about it. And I was able to use TikTok trends to make it relevant. And I think like the rest is history. Like, it just was able to find its niche and its people, and it's still growing. I think hashtag the boy with fire has over 500,000 views now on TikTok, which is insane. Like, and it's just been me, right? Like these past 4 months. And so, and now more people are joining, and creating their own TikToks about it. So it's been really fun to see that. And I think it's going to change now. When the book comes out, I think I'm very excited to see more readers get to read the book. So a lot of people were already able to read the Boy with Fire through an e-arc, which is in the publishing world. Before a book is published, we tend to send out an advanced electronic copy, or sometimes even physical copies, to readers, to industry professionals, to reviewers, so who will get a head start on the novel and basically give the review, and that will help build up, hype for the book. And so a lot of people were able to read The Boy with Fire, and that's how you see some early TikToks and reviews for The Boy with Fire. And like, that's why it's been getting so many tractions, because so many people already read it and loved it, thankfully. And so now the general public is going to get it. So I'm very excited and also nervous to see how people react to it, and hopefully they'll love it, and maybe talk about it on social media, so I can take a rest and not talk so much.
No, because, and I think the best way for other people to get exposed to it is seeing it from other readers, where they're like, oh, it was, because obviously if an author writes a book, it's like, okay, they're obviously going to promote their own book. But when you hear it from other people, it's like, oh, like someone else I know really loved this book, maybe I should read it. Because I was confused how a lot of other people had already read it, because I was seeing that on your social media, and I was like, wait, but doesn't it come out later? So those were people that they were just able, because it doesn't Goodreads have that where you can like go and get the book early?
Yeah, no, Goodreads doesn't have it, but Goodreads is where people post the reviews. So like, the publishing website that we use is called NetGalley. And so traditional publishers, hybrid publishers, even self-published authors use that site. And so that's where readers can request for free an advanced early copy, and they can either get accepted or rejected. And basically they get an early copy in exchange for an honest review. So all these readers were able to get an early electronic copy in exchange for an honest review. And of course, most of them have been good. There all have been some not bad reviews, but just reviews where the book wasn't the right fit for the reader, and that's okay. I think it's all about opinions, and it can be with you might love a book or a movie, and then your friend might not like it, and that's okay. I think that's just part of the trade, but that's something that it took me a while to understand, especially as a debut author. I was like, I want everyone to love my book, but that's just not possible.
Even like the best Amazon product has some negative reviews.
Exactly.
Yeah. Where do you want to go from here? After your book is released, where do you see yourself in like the next year? When are you going to start working on the second book? What plans do you have for you said trilogy, so I'm assuming like 3 books.
Yeah. Well, definitely in a year's time, the hardcover will be released for The Boy with Fire. And I think like this might be the first podcast I'm going to announce it, but The Boy with Fire has also been picked as a book box exclusive.
What's a book box exclusive?
So basically, in the publishing world, there are things called book boxes, where the biggest are like Illumicrate, Fairy Loot. Another one's like Nerdy Book Box, who I'm working with. And The Boy with Fire will be their book of the month for March 2022. And so what happens is that you're going to get a copy of The Boy with Fire with an exclusive new cover, with amazing like book merch items that come with it. And so that you will get it all in a beautiful, pretty box mailed to you, I think in March or something, or in April. So that's going to be, your signed copy, as well as I think it might be signed, I'm not sure, but you get your book, but you also get candles or like a book pin or bookmark, all that.
Oh, cool. Oh, so this is for people who are like part of book clubs and stuff. They are getting this in advance.
Or like, you don't have to be a part of book club. You could just say like, if you really love a book, sometimes it's like books have like special editions that are only exclusive through that book box. And so you might get in the reader world, people are like very, very like crazy and intense about this. Like if they have a book that they love and a book box picks it up and it's going to be an exclusive edition, like they will
Oh,
buy it.
I
Like
see. Okay.
so it's like exclusive, like reprinted, like with a new cover, and you get like these beautiful like book merch items with it. So that's kind of like what goes into it. So The Boy with Fire was picked as March 2022, which I'm also hoping the hardcover will be available through then by then as well. And so I think for the next year, more releases of like The Boy with Fire and its different variations, but then also writing book 2. I'm already starting to write it, but it's proved to be a little bit difficult when I'm still promoting book 1. Like book 1 isn't even out yet, and then people are already demanding book 2, the early readers. And I just haven't had the time to focus on it because I'm trying to get The Boy with Fire off the ground so as many people get to hear about it and buy it, during release week and release month. And so I think like in the next few weeks, I'm still going to be marketing and promoting like crazy. But after that, I'm hoping to take a step away from social media and through marketing and really go back to where it all started, which is the writing part. And so start delving into book 2.
Oh, how long do you expect that to take? Like the process of writing
the first draft, I think it would probably take like hopefully maybe 3 to 4 months, like it took book 1. I can't really predict it because you never know what happens, like what life throws at you. But I'm hoping book 2 will come out, in 2023.
Wow. So then after that, you're like, okay, book 3 might come out like 2 or 3 years after. And it's like
the full trilogy.
That's so exciting because 5 years is not that long of a time to go from like not having any books to
having 3,
having a trilogy. Yeah. Like this could get picked up for a movie. Imagine
I
that.
really hope so. That'd be really cool.
I would love that. Yeah, I have heard that this is similar. Like I think when someone put it on their social media or you shared it or it reminded me or I saw something of Dune, like this book called Dune.
Yes, so The Boy with Fire has been comped as Dune meets the Poppy War. Dune being the classic desert sci-fi by Frank Herbert, and the Poppy War being a Chinese mythology inspired war trilogy by R.F. Kuang.
That is a mix. Yeah,
it very much brings the vibes of these 2 books. And so when a new book comes out, what happens in the publishing world is that it gets comped or compared to like 2 to 3 earlier works. And so if you're a reader, if you're a fan of Dune and the Poppy War, you might like The Boy with Fire. And so I really hope even the hype for the new Dune movie like helps with The Boy with Fire, because it's very, very similar, I think, to Dune, and like it has sci-fi elements. It's based in a desert. There's like a religion that's very powerful, and there's an idea of a prophet. Like that's Dune too.
Okay, yeah, I had seen that. So I was just wondering because I never read Dune myself, but I had heard that it was like an action, sci-fi, all that kind of stuff mixed in. So super cool. Just wanted to ask if there were any last things you wanted to add in, or where people can find you, where they can find your book, where they can order it, all that.
I guess I would say go buy The Boy with Fire if you want a badass South Asian epic fantasy with firebending, unapologetic women, and a DILF that looks like Amitabh Bachchan. I will say you can buy it on Amazon starting on August 31st, but you can also get it through Barnes & Nobles and Book Depository Indigo. If your local bookstore or Barnes & Nobles does not have The Boy with Fire, or your library doesn't, you can easily request, like call your local library, call your local bookstore or Barnes & Nobles, and ask them to buy copies of The Boy with Fire to stock up in it. It really helps us, like, smaller authors, especially authors of color, when readers go out their way to call their bookstores and say, I really love this book and I think you should stock up in it, because I think a reader's word is more powerful than an author. So
I didn't know you could do that with a library too.
Yeah, you can go. Libraries usually have like request forms of like, I want this book to be can we request this book for our local library? And usually libraries can.
So where can people find you on social media?
Yeah, so on Instagram and Twitter, I'm spirited_gal. And then on TikTok, I'm on Aparna Writes, and you should definitely follow me on TikTok, because if you want to see some fun book marketing or just me, being silly and character skits, go follow me on TikTok.
Yeah, I'm going to link these in the podcast description. And then for like to buy your book though, do people just go on Amazon, or like what's the
so you can buy the paperback and ebook on Amazon. And throughout September, it will be available on other websites like Indigo, which is, I think, a big one in Canada, Waterstones, which is in the UK, and then Book Depository, and Kobo, which is more of like an international book website.
So thank you so much for joining me today. I learned a lot about, the world of publishing and just your journey. And I'm really excited to just share your story. And I'm looking forward to reading this book when it comes out.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for having me on. Make sure you guys buy The Boy with Fire, and welcome to the Kingdom of Raven.
And that's a wrap. Thanks for tuning into today's episode, and we'll see you next time.